I have class at 12, so I'm going to keep y'all to 11:50 as an end time, which sort of, changed the ideal nature of my presentation because, ideally, experiential education, you'd want to get people involved in doing stuff. But with the nature of this topic and with the amount of material I'm going to cover, it's going to be going over some points using a PowerPoint, and then I have some resources and activities that you can do after this on your own. And then if you want to be in conversation with me or other CTL faculty about those activities, we'd love it. So my name is Beth Lovern. I teach anthropology and sociology here on both campuses. And I'm also a member of the NetView team. The NetView team is working together on opportunities to increase students' awareness and participation in things related to vocation on both campuses. And we have a grant. It's called the NetView Program Development Grant, administered by the Council of Independent Colleges with support from the Lilly Endowment. And so with this grant, I was able to go to the National Society for Experiential Education meetings with some of my colleagues in September. And I attended several workshops on assessment, and then other presentations on experiential education from people from other schools. So then I did some more reading to try to piece it together in a way that would be useful for y'all. Mainly I'm looking at it from a course perspective, right? Not so much at the college level, but some of these principles can be applied to those. Okay, so we've got let's see. One of the inspirations for what I do is being able to work with students and teach them new ideas and how to use those ideas in the world. And so Bell Hooks's quote, "To educate is a practice of freedom," is a way of teaching that anyone can learn. And to hear that from somebody like Bell Hooks, I was like, that's inspiring. So to that, I would add, yes, maybe even me, right? So what are our outcomes for today? Let's see. We're hoping that participants will become familiar with some basic definitions of and methods of experiential learning and education, which are two different things, but we're not going to get too much into those today, and assessment. Then again, to understand the role of experiential education in designing for the student achievement of the outcomes, the learning outcomes that you would want them to get out of your courses or out of your programs, okay? And then a third desired outcome today for participants would be to gain knowledge of the basic tools to begin designing experiential learning for the purposes of assessing it, and vice versa, designing assessment for the purposes of experiential learning. So it can be a two-way street. And then last, becoming aware of the resources to integrate experiential education with assessment strategies going forward. So from here, maybe we all have some common language and principles to use to design our own. Okay. All right. Can I close this door? I feel like I'm being loud. Huh? I'm not going to set it up right now. Thanks, though. Did you get a packet? Okay, great. So we've got a structure here. Why experiential education? What's the point? What's the purpose? What can we expect from it? Then linking experiential education with some principles of assessment. Then I've got some activities and handouts to go over. Then I'd like to take questions from our folks in Athens, and then questions from the people in Demarest. We can take off the or we can add the audio for y'all in Demarest at the end. Okay, why bother with experiential education? Okay, well, some of this comes from the very foundation of educational theory and practice in the United States. Yay, like Dewey, who called it an educative experience. What's the... Okay. Parker Palmer was promoted this type of education because it provides an opportunity for live encounters with students in settings, including the classroom and outside the classroom. High impact practices, that's a big buzzword now for our QEP, right? HIP, high impact practices that promote student learning, according to Q from 2008. And then designing for risk and failure, because colleges give students an opportunity to fail in a relatively safe setting, right? It's not necessarily the real world, but it does prepare them for it. So a messy experience is something that is desirable in this way. And then real world problem solving for the future. This is what students themselves are saying that they want out of their college experience, is they want to be ready for their future jobs and careers, okay? So I'd like to hear from a few of y'all some other things. Why experiential education? I know all of you already do it, so what do you think would be a benefit, or you see as a benefit?
Students learn more.
Students learn more, right? Going back to Q, it promotes student learning. They learn more.
It broadens the experience, and that kind of goes into what you said, but
Right.
I mean, it's not just the curriculum, it's beyond the curriculum.
Right.
A little bit.
Broadening their experience. Okay.
I think students learn in different ways, and experiential education may be one of the better ways for some students to learn.
Okay.
As opposed to study or reading.
Right. So Brian is saying that students, some of them learn in different ways, and some of them learn better using experiential methods. I like it because I can see the wheels turning, right? And that's a fun thing for me. All right, so let's go to a standard definition of experiential education. That educators purposely engage with learners in direct experience and focused reflection to increase knowledge, develop skills, clarify values, and develop people's capacities to contribute to their communities. Okay, so there's two major education associations that tackle experiential education. One of them is the AEE, the Association for Experiential Education. Okay, and the other one is the NSEE. And so the NSEE is the National Society for Experiential Education, and that's the one we went to their conference in September. Highly recommended to get really in the mix with these ideas and other practitioners, right? So I've linked to the 8 principles of good practice for all experiential learning activities. I'm not going to click on it because I've given you the list in your packet. I think it's on the 7th or 8th page. At the top, it'll say the NSEE 8 principles of good practice for all experiential learning activities. Okay? And running your ideas by this list can give you a better way to dig in and work out some of the issues that you might have with designing your course or your activities, right? So the first one is about intentionality, right? Being clear about what it is that you're trying to gain from this experience. That's a huge one. And it's one that I sometimes miss, right, when I'm planning. The second one is preparedness and planning. okay, being prepared. A third one is authenticity, right? Having a real world context and being meaningful and relevant, okay? Including the reflection component, right? Right? Transforming simple experience into a learning experience, right? That's a big component in our Compass program, for example, right? Orientation and training, right? To allow instructors to become facilitators. Monitoring and continuous improvement, we call that the loop. So the assessment loop and the experiential education loop, you'll find that a lot of the best practices are found in both, right? Assessment and evaluation, of course, assessment, right? And then acknowledgement, right? How everybody recognizes the process and how it benefits them, okay? So I'd like to hear from our Athens folks. Which one of these do you think might be the most important to how you think about experiential education? Authenticity, okay, the real world setting, right?
And reflection.
Reflection, okay. Time spent on reflection is time spent learning.
I think intentionality is important. I don't think we always expect students to be intentional in their learning. We provide things for them, but I don't think we always expect them to be an active participant in all of that.
Right. And we'll get to that about one of the methods we can use to help students with that process, right? Any others? Do I hear assessment? Assessment. What about y'all? We'll get to that later. Okay. Wait, what'd I miss? Assessment's so important. Right? Okay. Kolb and his learning cycle. This is one of the biggest, most common things that we saw at NSEE and certainly in the books I've been reading on both assessment and experiential education. So from Kolb's 1984 book about experiential learning, he talks about this learning cycle that is a continuous loop again. Maybe you can start on different points of this, but typically concrete experience is one we consider first for the experiential education component. And then moving along to reflective observation and how reviewing that experience enhances the learning, right? And the understanding of why they did it. Then to the program of abstract conceptualization. In the process of reflection, you are learning about the experience, but it becoming more conceptualized within the learner's own understanding is an important key of this process. And then you can go to abstract experimentation, where you can try out what you've learned. It's another aspect of experiential education. So you're not just stopping with the first one, concrete experience, okay? It has to be part of the loop in order for it to be most effective, is what these principles of Kolb's learning cycle say, and then are used in many of these assessment and experiential education endeavors. All right, anybody familiar with Kolb's learning cycle? Okay, right? Okay, so it's another thing. We need a book for that, and we can share these and talk about these ideas more widely at another point. Okay, so this table was put into this book right here. This book to me is awesome. This is Jay Roberts, Experiential Education in the College Context. What it is, how it works, and why it matters. It's a new book. It came out in 2016, and he's an experiential educator. I think he spends a lot of time mountain hiking in the mountains with faculty and things like that. But this book goes into the theory, okay? And then it provides the methods, and then it provides his typologies of experiential education, all right? So very, very crucial, I think, for looking at and exploring experiential education. And he gave us this table in the book that he took from Barr and Tagg's work from 1995, comparing an instruction paradigm with a learning paradigm. And for those of you in education, you know that schools are now moving away from instructor paradigms to learner paradigms, a learner-centered approach, right? We're not just providing instruction, we are what?
Focused on their learning.
Right, forcing them to learn on, to watch the learning, yeah. Focusing on their learning, right. And so there's a few things even if we've done active learning in our classes, there's a way we can enhance that to make sure it's a learner paradigm. So a first instructional paradigm that we're all familiar with is the teacher-centered content delivery. Okay, our lectures and the other things we require. And that's great, but there's the learning paradigm now is shifted toward the student-centered learning. With the instruction paradigm, a faculty transfers knowledge to the students, right? I've got my bucket. I'm here to fill your bucket. Okay, but with the learner-centered paradigm, the students co-constructs and discovers the information alongside faculty, okay? And this is something that I've learned how to do mainly from our own education professors here at Piedmont who've been my mentors for, I've been here like 10 years, and y'all all taught me how to do this stuff. So thank you, Wilma, Teresa, and Katrina. I mean, and Kenyon, I rely on y'all to tell me, like, what are some of these things that you think will work for my students in my classroom? And you've all shared this with me. So focusing on courses and programs is the instructor paradigm, of course, but then we go toward focusing on creating powerful learning environments. Those environments may become co-curricular, right, like with Compass, and they may certainly lend themselves to QEP and our high impact practices, right? So it becomes the responsibility of the institution to support the learning environment. Success defined through course evaluations. While they're important piece of the puzzle, a learning paradigm would show success defined through students being able to demonstrate that they're learning their outcomes. And then, internal or external, reviewers could be able to see that, right? That demonstration. Instructional paradigm includes focusing on end of course and what's called private assessments, meaning the test between you and the student, whereas the learning paradigm focuses on iterative and developmental feedback with public assessments. This is where like a rubric that's developmental can be very crucial instead of just a standard rubric to show the progress of the students over time, right? But it's hard to do within one single course. That's the problem. Let's see. The last one here, we have faculty and students working independently and in isolation. This idea that they're just going to learn on their own if you present the content to them instead becomes collaborative, cooperative, supportive, and co-generated work. Okay, so students working together and with faculty. Okay, so for a lot of you, this is nothing new if you've been working on education and QEP and things like that, but I wanted to reinforce some of these things as the perspective of experiential education. Okay, anybody have anything to add to this table or want to highlight it? Okay. All right, so Roberts is giving us a few of the models for overall education. What he's done is create typologies of the type of experiential education that occurs and telling us, well, these are how you can group them, okay? So the first one is active learning. cooperative or game-based or case studies, things that happen typically like in the classroom too. Brian, active learning. I bet you do a lot of that with your student art projects and things like that. Anybody have an example they want to give for active learning that they use? Science lab. That's a perfect example, right? Active learning, okay. But that's a good example. Community-based learning, okay. A little harder to get in the classroom sometimes, but it's good for a co-curricular approach, including service projects, something that's place-based, right? Making the most of your own community and your interaction with the students, the relationships with students. And then, of course, off-campus. Typically, can do that. So, for example, the NetView vocation program, we're sending students on alternative spring break this March, and that's an example of community-based learning. Okay, they'll be reflecting on their experiences and bringing them back to Piedmont. Anybody have any other examples of Piedmont work in this area? Go for it.
I mean, I think sometimes student worker jobs can be
okay.
kind of like a route to like provide an experiential education experience.
Okay, so student worker jobs, right? They learn how to be in the community, right? Integrative learning is a third component that we Roberts describes as integrating, what a student might expect in the future with their current academic work. So integrating with the learning that they're getting there with the internships or work or other co-curricular. So anything student?
One of the field experiences that I did with my kids was instead of putting them in the classroom to see language arts methods being done, I sent them to a school library, Barnett Shoals School Library.
Okay.
And they spent their field experience there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of interesting because they never really realized that literacy extends beyond the classroom into community center types of endeavor.
Right. Right. And then even from there into the home.
Yeah.
Right. And student teaching, of course, is a good example of integrative learning. A fourth one that he describes as problem and project-based learning, including inquiry-based types of endeavors, capstone projects, practitioner experience, and things like that. So, the challenge, of course, if you're looking at it from a course perspective, is how do you put these things within a course? I mean, you can expect students to have them at different times of their education if they're in a major, but if you're having like a gen ed class, for example, how would you integrate maybe one of these practices? I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. All right. So here comes some principles for designing for experiential education. Okay, we talked about, I think you mentioned something about a student doesn't always realize the intentionality of the approach. This is where framing can help us. Framing as a purposeful, meeting and working with students to establish the why. Why are we doing this over this semester? Or why are we doing this activity, right? So they don't do something, they don't come away with the wrong aspect of it, right? Or the wrong idea. For example, I teach anthropology, and one of the worst things an anthropologist could do is show some ethnographic film that they don't properly frame, and the student comes away with a more entrenched type of stereotype of that group. Okay, so it takes heavy framing to properly introduce some ethnographic films, especially if they were filmed in the 60s or 70s, right? Because they tend to lack the framing, whereas things that are produced now tend to be a little more integrative of the kind of discussion that you need to have with regard to stereotypes, colonialism, and other things. Then you're establishing the relevance to students. Why should they care, right? What are they going to get out of this? How is it going to shape or affect their learning? right? So I'd love to hear an example from one of y'all who uses framing in the classroom.
With the pamphlets I have the students do, I have them, I talked about part of the end product is they're designing a pamphlet that's at the level of a high school student, but then they have to do a paragraph at the level of the course. Because as nurses, they need to be able to understand this, the jargon of the scientific, but be able to bring it down to a lay person. So I explained that the whole purpose of this is to learn more about disease,
right.
Learning how to talk about two different levels.
Right. Sounds like you've tricked them into learning. And it highlights, you're framing the impact that their job will have on the public, right? And working with the public. So that's perfect for relevance. I love it. With lesson planning, this is the nuts and bolts and tricky, because who has time in the course to do everything you want to do? It means you have to cut. You have to cut some of the content and or you give them extra work, right? Which are you going to do? But lesson planning includes, right? Lesson planning includes looking at the way they're learning from the learner perspective, where they're coming into the program from, right? Are they a freshman, a first-year student? Are they, a developed senior in the capstone level? What are they bringing to your class in terms of their understanding? But also, of course, like I said, time. How do you devote time to providing these experiential opportunities? How much can you expect them to spend outside of class working on these things that, are important to you and things like that? And then resources, the materials you would need, also the place. If it's in another setting, how are you going to do that, right? Facilitating, you've got how the instructor, how the faculty member approaches this from a perspective of establishing dialogue with the students. This can be another landmine given certain classes that don't always go the way you want them to go, or introducing new things that you want to do. And so this is where Bell Hooks comes in with Teaching to Transgress, is the way she describes her efforts to get students to think about being more responsible for their education, and then trying to facilitate a class that may or may not go smoothly, right? And then this also includes processing reflection with guided inquiry. It's not just reflection, not just asking them to reflect, but making sure they're moving along the process of reflection with the abstract conceptualization from the Kolb model. Reflection, right, is a component. Ownership, of course, authentic learning by students. Making what they feel apply to them. And lastly, evaluating, right? This is where we sort of motor into assessment, okay? So we all know what assessment is, quickly defined. It's collecting data to verify student learning, okay? The effectiveness of instruction, and monitor the efficacy of a course or a program. Okay, that's a basic definition. Other aspects of assessment that are key include that it be continuous, right? That it not just stop with the end of the assessment, but that you're using the data collected to improve and to tinker with for more improvement of student learning. The purpose there is improvement, and it implies a backwards design, again, that all education professors know about, is you start from the end and you work backwards. You start with the student learning outcomes, what you want them to have, and work backwards. So in this way, you can include these strategies, right? And again, this is assessment strategies for anything. You can use it for anything. But at my level, going into the NSEE, I wasn't fully aware of all the aspects of assessment that I should be. So this is why I'm sharing it with y'all. Formative assessment, right, where you get feedback in the process of learning. Yeah, I'm very comfortable with that, and I know y'all are too. A summative assessment, measuring the end of that activity or course knowledge. Then you've got direct assessment versus indirect. With experiential education, this is where it can get tricky because indirect assessment is measuring a student's perception of learning, and that's a little bit easier to get. But with experiential education, how do you get the direct assessment? You have to focus on demonstrating their learning. So you have to come up with ways to do that. The cool thing is the best practices of experiential education and assessment align very well, okay? And they support each other. For example, backward course design is absolutely crucial for assessment and for experiential education, right? That's one thing that they share. Then you also want to assess and create experiential learning opportunities for what you value, okay? What is it about your course that you really, really want them to get out of it? And what is it that you want to do in terms of active or experiential learning? Those should align. And, the question is, how much of that are you willing to assess as part of your grade for the course? A lot of professors want to include the assessment of experiential education in their course, but maybe they shy away from making it part of their grade, right? They just want to have students have their practice with it. Well, that's sort of a question. How much of your grade would you assign to that? And how rigorous can you be assessing it? Or is it, do you feel like that's appropriate? So those are some issues. Assessing what you value means that you need to come down and focus on 1, 2, or 3 major outcomes, right? And those should be aligned with what you value. And maybe not it's just you. Maybe it has to do with your school's mission too, right? Assess what the school wants you to aligns with their mission. So then you have to decide what evidence is needed to demonstrate learning or proficiency. This is the one where I can't give you like any kind of magic bullet. It's something that comes out of what you teach, right? Or what you're looking for, okay? Here's some differences in approaches, again, found in the Roberts book, but brought from the Wiggins and McTeague article from 2005. So on the left side, we have, when thinking only like an activity designer, we ask, okay, because I like to do fun things in my classes. I want the students to get up and moving or not just sit there and do a lecture. So sometimes I trap myself in thinking just like this, right? Because I don't push it further, because you want to think like an assessor, okay? If you're doing experiential education, you also want to think like an assessor and then bring those best practices to both. So for example, you might ask, hey, what's a fun or interesting thing I could do on this topic with my students? Okay, that's thinking only like an activity designer. If you're going to integrate it with assessment, then your approach is, given the goals, what performance tasks must drive the instructional work? Okay, so that's easy for teaching because because your goal is that they become teachers, right? But for gen ed, if it's, what's an example for gen ed where you have to, what performance task? Oh, thank you, it's 11:35, okay. That might be something that's like valuing or something. So how do you demonstrate that, huh? Right, yeah. So what task can you assign to allow them to demonstrate that? Activity designers might ask, what projects might students want to do on this topic? Whereas assessors think like, what would be a sufficient and revealing form of understanding or evidence of understanding, right? What is it that they can show me that they've learned from this? How will I give a grade and justify it? Assessors would think, what criteria do we appropriately consider work, and how do we assess levels of quality? Okay, so instead of just assigning grades, what criteria and standards are you giving to the student? That's where rubrics come in handy. What test should I give based on the content I taught? And moving to an assessment perspective, am I clear on the reasons behind the learner mistakes? Right? If they didn't get something, do I know why? Instead of just focusing on the type of test. How well do students do on the test from an activity perspective becomes, did the assessments really reveal and distinguish those who understood from those who only seemed to? Okay, this is the struggle I'm currently having in my classes for the cultural cultural competency, right? Because there's something about my essay assignment for that that isn't capturing the student learning that is taking place in the classroom. So I've got to go back and retool and figure out why the essay assignment that I have doesn't capture like the things that they're revealing to me about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism in our classroom discussions. So gotta retool that. Anybody else have any examples of this perspective or that things that they're struggling with?
An example of using that perspective is when I design a new course, I try to think, what is it about this course that a teacher needs to be able to do when they get out there?
Right. Okay, so Teresa said, what is it about this course that, sorry, I'm trying to, sorry.
Since I'm teaching would-be teachers.
Right, right.
What about the content of
The
this
content.
course do teachers need to be able to actually accomplish when they
Right.
get in the classroom?
Right. Do teachers need to be able to do when they get into the classroom? In case y'all couldn't hear that. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good one because it's focusing on what a teacher needs to do outside of the classroom.
And then the content comes from what do they need to know to be able to do those things.
Yeah, so backwards design with the content. Okay. Brian?
Well, the comparison between the top two, what's a fun and interesting activity on this topic versus what goals and tasks must drive the work. I mean, that's sort of like if you want to think about it like a dyad, like I think that's like a dyad that every higher ed art educator struggles with because in general, perception of the profession is the first, but the reality is the latter, right? Many people think like it's kind of a popular perception, even on the part of the students, that a studio art course is a collection of fun and interesting activities designed to get you up and moving.
Right.
And then the reality is that like there are things that need to be taught.
Right.
and so, but like one of the benefits of being an art teacher is that reality. So it's how designing a project that actually embrace both. Yeah, that's like the substance of my life.
I figured. So have you overcome that or steps that you've
Well, it doesn't happen
found?
like perfectly every time. Typically, like I try and design courses that like I'm teaching one task and that's project number one. And then project number two, I'm teaching another task, but it also draws on the task that project number one addressed, right? So the projects are cumulative. So it's like, if you're thinking about like each project as a plate spinning, like it's like I hand the student a plate to spin. And then by the end of the semester, I've given them all these other plates and they're having to keep them all spinning. So that's something that I'm like in assessing, I'm looking like, well, how well do they do the new thing?
Right.
But I'm also still looking at like the first thing I taught them, and typically that's what they're doing best because they've done it that many times.
So like a developmental framework might be helpful too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. I was going to say that the thing is that the instructor, the teacher, has to understand that the fun and interesting activities that they're planning are not the be-all and end-all. You know, in the Wiggins and McTighe book, it talks about a unit on apples. And the kids, these are kindergarten kids, and they make applesauce, and they look at apples, and they cut the apple to make a star, and, you know, all of these different things, which are all fun activities, but really there's no learning going on. It's just, oh, look at the pretty apples, you know. So a lot of times we stop at the fun and interesting and don't think about the other side of it, the performance task, and what's really intended out of that instruction.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and that's something I need to work on too, because I'm like, oh, I've got something I want to do today. And I mean, it increases their level of activity and interest, but how much, does it? Or do I need to switch to something that takes a few weeks instead and then really engages them? So the methods of assessment that are most relevant to experiential education include, of course, formative assessments where you give the feedback. Mainly, anything will work, but simulations are good, and games for students, or even having them come up with their own games or their own things to share. Discussions can enter into that. A major one is projects and performances, art, right? And teaching, right? You have to prove. Doing the tasks and challenges of that discipline or of that subject. In anthropology, cultural anthropology, I have students do many ethnographies and use interviewing techniques and transcribing and things like that. Similarly in biology, labs and things. And then it could be individual or team-based. Maybe that's is what switches it up from something regular. Rubrics are useful in assessment for experiential education. Critical thinking, reflection, and writing. I have an example here of a rubric used by Nazareth College. It's toward the back of your packet, experiential learning rubric. The first two are FLT4 and 2. Those stand for reflection, and this is how they've designed their rubric for reflection. The other ones are application and integration. So this is their experiential learning rubric that they've shared at the conference. And they received an award. They received a President's Award for how well they've integrated at their college experiential learning across the entire college. Because mainly their problem there that they wanted to address was how students saw each other in terms of difference. And they doubled down and said, okay, we're going to solve this through various methods, and they came together and worked on that. So their experiential learning goes more across the whole school and is integrated school-wide. So including criteria and standards. When you give out an assignment sheet, it might just have the criteria, but the standards could be written in a rubric form so they know how they're meeting those levels. And the Allen book, I bought this, Julia, helped me with this, assessing general education programs, for sort of like the basic thing of what I need, because I teach mainly gen ed. Learning portfolios, this is the new way to go. This is the big thing, but similar to an art portfolio, right? Documenting the development of a student's progress over time, and including their experiential education opportunities, right? So locating and collecting students' work, showing the development over time, and you can apply rubrics to these too, right? So these are the main things that were highlighted, in our participation in the conference and in the Roberts book. The list is not exclusive to this, but this is a good starting point. All right, so then we have the assessment loop. Giving students the opportunity for indirect assessment too, right? Not just direct assessment, but having the feedback after you give them the opportunities for experiential learning to see what they think they learned and how well they think they learned it from the experience. Maybe in the form of surveys or focus groups or evaluations, right? Then compiling artifacts, as you'll know, for indirect and direct assessment. And then using evidence from both to make adjustments in experiential education opportunities and the assessment strategies, right? So make sure you continue that loop and are continually things. Okay, so I designed 2 activities for this. We won't have time today to complete them, but they're to get you thinking. The first one is take an activity that you're already doing in your class and approach it from the best practices of experiential education and assessment strategies, right? So in this process, you also want to be able to explain why you do this and what you think you get out of it. Then you can take it and measure it up next to the 8 principles for the best good practices in all experiential learning endeavors, or something like that list that I gave you. And certainly also, put it up next to the Kolb cycle. See how you can complete that cycle in that activity that you're already doing, that you already like, that your students already like, how you can sort of maximize the learning effect of that. All right. Then focusing on the types of evidence that the students could produce from that activity to ensure that you can measure their learning. Okay, that's, again, linking those two things together. How will you show students the criteria and standards for that outcome as well, right? Okay, activity B is taking the opposite approach, where you start with a learning outcome that you think is important. You have to be honest about that, and that lends itself to experiential education. Some do more than others. That's okay, right? So then you'll use the models of experiential education, choosing one that's appropriate for meeting this outcome, right? Design an activity that would meet experiential and assessment best practices. So again, taking your outcomes first, seeing which one would lend itself to a really well thought out experiential education program, and then following the steps here. How does it address the learning outcome? How will you facilitate student learning in this experience? How do you lesson plan for that? What do students do to engage them in the process of learning? What evidence can the students produce? And how can the students demonstrate proficiency and mastery of the outcome or developmental improvement? So you could do either or both or none, or just think about it, right? And that's all I have. Thank y'all so much for listening. I'll take a couple questions from Athens, and then we'll see if Demarest has any questions. Huh? Oh, okay. Right. I might have him on here too. Do y'all have any questions? Okay.
I have a question about the assessment loop. The idea that you give students the opportunity for indirect assessment for their perception of their own learning experience. 3 of the suggestions for that are surveys, focus groups, and evaluations. And I was actually just thinking about this when I noticed that there was a survey for this presentation. Later today, I imagine I'll go home and open up an email. There'll be surveys for recent purchases that I made.
Right.
I feel like we're kind of living in an age of what I think of as survey fatigue.
Right.
And there's a lot of interactions, many of which I don't necessarily consider meaningful, that are accompanied by requests for feedback.
Yes.
Could you rank your experience with the electric service provider's customer service today on the phone? It's no, click,
right.
done. And do you find that also comes into that attitude of I don't want to complete a survey?
Right.
It comes into the classroom, and how do you combat
that? I would do a survey not on a piece of paper, but just poll the class. See how honest they can get, and then, do you see what I'm saying? Sort of push it to become a discussion. That might help with some of the fatigue, but then you're going to lose some of the honesty or the willingness to, I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I'm
yeah. Yeah.
I did one class, I had a class assessment.
Uh-huh.
And it's only 2 questions, and the first one was, what was the most important thing you learned today? Mm-hmm. The second is, what do you still have questions about? And I collate those, and that's how the next class starts.
Oh, good, right. And I like that too, like giving them just 2 open-ended questions,
well,
right?
They write it out, it's
right.
anonymous,
Uh-huh.
so then I can take it and work with it, because sometimes we don't teach they don't learn what we think we're teaching.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, I like the 2 open-ended responses is not like a typical survey. But I guess what I was trying to explain before was really a focus group. A focus group approach might help with some of that fatigue. Because I tell my students when we, in college, I got a marketer phone call, and they're like, what kind of toilet paper do you use? And I'm like, I have no idea. It's like every single thing, or like you said, every single thing you buy is, they want to know about it. And we get,
I think it also is how you word the questions. Mm-hmm. So on a survey, the questions may be worded one way. I'm thinking about our college evaluations for courses as opposed to the private evaluations that I do. I always have my students fill out an evaluation. Mine are worded quite differently, and I get much more usable data from my survey than I do from the evaluations from the school.
Yeah.
Yeah, the kids elaborate more, and I think it's just in the way that I've worded the questions.
Right. And then there you can address like more issues of the things we talked about, like authenticity and framing, and did these things come across with the learning experience?
I think it might also be timing is an important factor. What one was talking about, the end of each class is very different than what students are used to. Is the end of the course they're supposed to fill out this online evaluations, the standard questions. That's one thing that really hits me as fatigue, especially at the end of the semester.
When you're doing it for 5 classes.
Yeah. Right. But along the way, after a particular project or a particular activity, to ask a couple of questions like, what did you learn from this? How could it have been better? Something, just a couple of things like that, open-ended, that people can give specific direct feedback that they understand, hopefully will have an effect in the classroom. People aren't used to that. Students aren't used to being asked that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I asked this as an open question because I thought about doing this over the years, because the online course evaluations are pretty much, I hate to say this, useless. Outside of the written parts, and they don't normally leave that much written. Although I sometimes get constructed, but it's very rare. So I thought about doing this as part, not as the final exam, but like the last day of class, something like that. Is that more useful for those that have done this?
Yeah, that's when I do mine.
Yeah, I do a class eval.
So before they do
It's
exam.
final.
Okay.
And I actually leave the room while they're doing it. I think that's helpful because then they can talk amongst themselves a little bit if they want to. And I'm usually down the hall and I can hear them talking. I can't really hear what they're saying, but I know there's interactions, so that they're talking to each other about the course and about what products and things.
Well, that's what we used to do back when it was done in person.
Yeah, exactly.
I kind of like it that way.
I have an online class that I ask in the middle of the semester.
Yeah.
And then you can leave an envelope, and so I tell them, I won't open the envelope until after I've graded your final, so submit grades. So, because they'll be like, it's going to affect how you're going to grade me. Like, nope, I'm not going to look at it until after finals are done, submit grades. So.
Let me move quickly to, are there questions from Demarest? Because.
No, they say they're signing off.
Okay. All right, that's good. All right, we'll sign off as well. Thank you all.